Hello AP History students and welcome to another session of AP Euroblast. I'm here to strike your interest in European history, activate your memory, draw connections, and get you ready for the AP exam. In our first two sessions, we looked at the 2020 DBQ rubric and how to prepare to get the evidence beyond the documents points. And you might remember that we referred to the World History DBQ on railroads and empires. And that's a great connection for the next several presentations that I want to give you on imperialism in the 19th century and the Second Industrial Revolution. So let's get started. Today we're going to get an overview of Europe's main economic and political motivations for 19th century imperialism, particularly in China and in Africa. And I want to start with this image from a popular British magazine. Who is this man? Why is he holding a wire and carrying a gun? And why is he standing on Africa? This is Cecil Rhodes, British imperialist and founder of the Rhodes Scholarship. He was so rich and powerful that an entire colony, Rhodesia, took its name from him. Although the colony's name was changed and now it's Zimbabwe, we still have the South African dog breed, the Rhodesian Ridgeback. If you know your geography, you will see that his right foot is on Cape Town in South Africa and his left foot is in Cairo in Egypt, both British holdings by the 1880s. He dreamed of connecting the two cities by railroad, and although they never were, it shows the scale of European ambitions and reflects just how quickly and thoroughly European countries were able to imperialize Africa and Asia. European imperialism had two main motivations. Politically, Europeans competed with one another because colonies were a matter of prestige, potential wealth, and strategic location. Economically, colonies provided raw materials like rubber, copper, and diamonds to Europe, all of which were in high demand during the Second Industrial Revolution. Colonies also had the potential of becoming consumer markets where Europeans could sell their rapidly increasing supply of goods. Now, imperialism itself wasn't a new thing. Spain, England, and the Netherlands all had started their empires in the 16th to 17th centuries and continued to hold on to at least parts of their empires in the 19th century. But 19th century imperialism was a very different thing. One, because it occurred in the industrial age, which changed everything. And two, because it involved new players, such as the ones we see at the table, carving up China, such as Germany, Russia, and Japan, and others we see in Africa. It's important to know the differences as well as the similarities of the two eras of imperialism. Just the sort of thing that has come up in previous exams and could come up again on the 2020 DBQ. You may wish to pause the video and take a longer look at this chart or come back to it. I'm going to highlight a few things quickly since we need to keep our focus on the 19th century today. First, imperialism in the 19th century was centered on China and Africa, something inconceivable during the early period when imperialism had centered on the Americas. Sure, the Dutch, the English, and the Portuguese had all traded there in the early period, but they relied on local leaders for their supply of spices, silks, and slaves. Unlike the American empires Europeans conquered with relative ease in the earlier period, Asian and African states and peoples had greater immunity to European germs and also had horses and steel. Second, as already pointed out, there were new European players involved, and this was largely because of industrialization, making them competitive and giving their economies a voracious appetite for raw materials. Third, unlike the earlier period when Europeans, especially Spain, set up large government systems to rule the colonies directly whenever they could, Europeans in the 19th century usually preferred to rule indirectly, or not at all, so long as they accomplished their economic and strategic goals. Last, unlike the earlier period when mercantilism led to nearly incessant wars up until the end of the 18th century, Europeans managed to settle their differences and found common ground through diplomacy. Now, looking into the specifics of 19th century imperialism in Africa and China, we're going to start with this image of a Chinese factory. That's right, I said factory. There are no machines and there's no smoke, but as we look through the first and then the second window, at the back and around the sides of the workshop, we realize that people are engaged in mass production, which is exactly what factories do. And for whom were they mass producing these paintings? For Europeans. China was happy to trade with Europe, but only if Europe paid in silver. And there was the problem. Europe ran huge trade deficits with China, all the while dreaming of the possibility of opening up a huge market for cheaply produced textiles and other goods, none of which interested China. Britain found the perfect solution in this beautiful red flower, the poppy, which grows all over Europe. But it also grew in British-controlled India, where it had long been consumed as a mild narcotic beverage, opium. The British changed two things about opium production and consumption. First, they mass-produced it, as we can see from this huge warehouse. Second, they turned it into a much more potent and addictive form, in which it was smoked. And then they exported it. They had finally found something other than silver for which there was an apparently limitless demand. The details of the Opium Wars are less important than the results. And what we see here is how Europe worked together through diplomacy. The Treaty of Nanjing established clear spheres of influence for France, Germany, Russia, and Japan. Those figures we saw sitting at the table a moment ago, which kept them from fighting. Although Russia and Japan did eventually go to war, it was over 60 years later. The other powers took even longer. At the Berlin Conference 42 years later, the same European powers, minus Russia, took a similar approach to Africa. They agreed to respect each other's claims whenever they were the first to establish European economic activity. As with China, peace was kept through diplomacy for several decades. Now, if we can ignore all the text here and just focus on the colors, we can see that Britain, light pink, and France, in red, controlled about 2/3 of Africa. You can also make out Cape Town and Cairo and imagine Cecil Rhodes' 2 feet. Now we're going to focus for a moment on that green region in the middle, the Belgian Congo, or as it was known up until 1908, the Free State of Congo. This view illustrates two things. First, how incredibly big Africa is. The Congo is 76 times the size of Belgium. In American terms, 5 times the size of Texas and 40% bigger than Alaska. Second, what an incredible advantage industrialization gave Europe if even tiny Belgium could rule an area this size. Let's turn now to an incident that occurred in 1898, the Fashoda incident. By that time, the British were in firm control of Egypt, but the French were expanding in the Sudan. This was highly sensitive since nothing less than control of the Nile River was at stake. Both countries, allies since the Crimean War, nearly went to war, but they resolved their differences peacefully with France backing down. Once again, as with the treaties of Nanjing and Berlin, diplomacy won the day, in sharp contrast to 16th, 18th century imperialism. Diplomacy with Britain gave France a long-term benefit as well in their colony of Morocco on the northwest coast. In 1905, Germany tried to force opening of trade there in what is known as the First Moroccan Crisis. Britain took France's side, and Germany was forced to back down. In addition to Germany's position violating the terms of the Berlin Conference, Britain and France stood the most to lose from the further growth of German aims, and this made them natural allies. So although the era was characterized by extended peace, tensions were clearly greater in 1905 than they had been 20 years earlier at the Berlin Conference. And competition over colonies in Africa, in fact, would become one of the main causes of World War I breaking out in 1914. We're going to conclude with 2 more images that draw in an even bigger global perspective. Here's the real reason why Britain was so sensitive to the expansion of other Europeans in Africa, the Suez Canal. This man-made passage, opened in 1869 and fully controlled by Britain since 1882, made it much easier for ships to pass between the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Naturally, whoever controlled the canal stood to make a lot of money taxing trade that went through it from all countries. For Great Britain in particular, the canal reduced the distance between London and India by about 5,000 miles, and obviously this meant huge savings in time and money. It also meant a larger, quicker, and cheaper supply of raw cotton to Britain. The same was true for Great Britain's finished textiles being shipped to India. And on Africa's other side, across the Atlantic Ocean, another canal would have the same effect, the Panama Canal. It connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and just like the Suez Canal, made it possible for shipping to pass through a continent rather than having to go around it. These 2 canals and a host of other breakthroughs in transportation and communication made the world a much more small and connected place. They were a direct result of imperialism and a direct contributor to it. How they became possible is the subject of our next session on the Second Industrial Revolution and 19th century imperialism. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and keep learning. Thank you for watching. It's been a blast.